quiet morning, and this chapter opens with a question rather than a story, which is a little different from most of what this book has offered so far. The chapter is called What If? And the question it's actually asking is deceptively simple, standing at a genuine decision point, right at the edge of quitting something difficult. What if the choice got projected forward instead of made in the immediate discomfort of the present moment? What if, instead of asking only how bad this feels right now, the mind also had to sit with two specific, vivid pictures of the future, one where the difficult thing got finished, one where it didn't. This chapter's argument is that most decisions to quit happen entirely inside the present tense, weighing only the discomfort directly in front of a person against nothing more specific than a vague, general sense that stopping would feel better. The what-if technique this chapter describes deliberately pulls two future moments into that same decision, forcing a comparison between them that the present tense version of the decision never actually includes on its own. I want to spend this whole episode on that technique because I think it's meaningfully different from the tools covered in earlier chapters of this book, even though it rhymes with several of them. Taking Souls a few chapters back was about converting present suffering into a private scoreboard, useful in the middle of an already difficult mile. This chapter's tool operates earlier, right at the decision point itself, before the suffering has necessarily even started, asking a person to genuinely imagine two different versions of tomorrow, rather than simply enduring today more cleverly. It's worth naming why a question-based chapter like this one feels like a fitting addition 11 chapters into a book that's mostly built around stories and hard-won lessons. Every previous chapter has described something that already happened, a failure, a triumph, a specific turning point, and asked what could be learned from it after the fact. This chapter is the first one aimed specifically at the moment before anything has happened yet, right at the decision itself, which makes it less a lesson to absorb and more a tool to actually use standing at a door before the outcome has been decided one way or the other. I think there's a reason this particular kind of chapter waited until chapter 11 to show up rather than appearing earlier in the book. A tool built around comparing two remembered futures only really works once there's enough real history to draw both futures from. Offered at the very start of transformation, before either kind of mourning had actually accumulated yet, this technique would have had almost nothing real to work with. By this point in the book, and by this point in this channel's own history, there's finally enough real material for the comparison to actually mean something. Here's the mechanism worth walking through carefully. Standing at a genuine decision point, quit or continue, skip or show up. The mind defaults to comparing the discomfort of continuing against the relief of stopping, both of which are available immediately and vividly. What almost never gets weighed with the same vividness is the future moment of looking back on this exact decision from either direction. Asterisk, the what-if technique asks a person to deliberately construct both of those future moments in detail before the decision actually gets made, rather than letting the immediate, vivid present quietly outcompete two vaguer, unexamined futures by default. There's a reason this imbalance happens so reliably, worth naming before moving to how the technique actually corrects for it. The present moment has an enormous advantage in any decision made without deliberate intervention. It's immediate, sensory, and impossible to ignore. A future moment, by contrast, has to be actively constructed, imagined, held in mind on purpose, which takes real cognitive effort a tired, resistant mind is rarely inclined to spend voluntarily. Left to its own devices, the mind will almost always let the vivid, effortless present simply win by default. Not because the future doesn't matter, but because summoning it convincingly takes work nobody does automatically under pressure. This is worth connecting to something covered even earlier in this whole series, the discipline equals freedom idea that closed out the previous book. That chapter argued freedom shows up immediately, produced by discipline in the present moment, not deferred to some future payoff. This chapter's technique might sound like it's contradicting that idea, deliberately reaching forward into the future rather than staying present. It isn't quite. The what-if technique doesn't ask a person to defer satisfaction to some distant future reward. It asks them to accurately recall what tomorrow, which arrives almost immediately anyway, actually tends to feel like based on real, recent precedent. The future being constructed here is close enough and grounded enough in genuine memory that it functions less like a distant abstraction and more like an extension of the same honest, present tense accounting this whole series has argued for from its very first episode. I want to bring this into something specific and personal because I think this technique has a clear, concrete version available for exactly the kind of decision this channel deals with constantly. There's a specific morning, cold, tired, genuinely tempting to skip entirely, where I actually tried this technique deliberately rather than just reading about it. Standing at the door, instead of simply weighing the immediate discomfort of going against the immediate relief of staying in, I actually constructed both future mornings explicitly. Tomorrow, having gone, feeling the same quiet satisfaction every other kept promise on this channel has produced. Tomorrow, having skipped, feeling the specific familiar flatness that always follows a broken one. Asterisk, asterisk. I want to describe both of those constructed futures in more detail than I usually would, because the detail is really the whole point of the technique. The satisfied version wasn't a vague sense of pride. It was specific. The particular ease of the next morning's decision, made without the small residual guilt a skipped day always seems to attach to whatever comes after it. The flat version was equally specific. The particular quality of a missed day's aftertaste, not dramatic, just a persistent, low-grade sense of having quietly let something slip, still there faintly 2 or 3 days later. That comparison, made explicit rather than left as background noise, changed the decision in a way that simply gritting through the discomfort in the moment never quite managed on its own. The discomfort of going was still exactly as real as it had been a moment earlier. What changed was that it was no longer competing against a vague, undefined alternative. It was competing against a specific, vividly imagined tomorrow that had, across 22 previous episodes of exactly this kind of decision, reliably felt worse than the discomfort of showing up ever actually did. What struck me most about that particular morning, looking back on it now, was how little the technique actually had to do with willpower in the way that word usually gets used. Nothing about constructing those two futures made the cold or the tiredness disappear. What it did was change what those sensations were actually being weighed against. And once the comparison included the accurate, specific weight of both possible tomorrows rather than just the vivid discomfort of one single moment, the decision itself became almost anticlimactic, obvious in a way it hadn't felt obvious even 60 seconds earlier. I've thought about that specific shift enough since to describe it a little more precisely. It wasn't that the future comparison overpowered the present discomfort through sheer emotional force. It simply added a second, equally real consideration to a decision that had, until that point, only been weighing one thing at all. Discomfort now versus discomfort now compared against two specific tomorrows isn't actually a fair fight for the first version to have been winning by default this whole time. There's a distinction worth drawing between this and the mile scoreboard tool from a few episodes back, because they're easy to blend together without actually being the same technique. The scoreboard tool operates during difficulty, converting suffering already in progress into something structured to hold on to. This tool operates before difficulty at the actual decision point, helping decide whether to begin at all. Asterisk asterisk 1 is for the middle of a hard mile that's already started. This one is for the doorway, the specific moment where the whole question of whether there's going to be a hard mile at all still hangs open. I want to walk through what actually makes this technique work, because imagine the future is vague enough advice to be nearly useless without a specific method attached. The key detail, easy to skip and doing most of the actual work, is specificity. A vague sense that future me will probably be glad doesn't compete well against vivid, immediate discomfort, the same way a generic motivational phrase failed to compete against detailed, catastrophizing narration a few episodes back. Asterisk asterisk, the version that actually works constructs both futures in real, sensory detail. What tomorrow morning satisfaction actually feels like specifically, based on every other morning that's felt that way before, versus what tomorrow morning's specific flatness feels like based on every other morning that's felt that way too. Both futures need to be built from genuine memory, not abstract prediction, for the comparison to actually carry any real weight. I want to be precise about the difference between a vague version of this technique and the specific version, because the gap between them is really the whole difference between something that works and something that doesn't. A vague attempt might sound like, "I'll probably feel better if I go." That sentence is true, and it's also almost entirely useless in the moment because it carries none of the sensory, remembered weight that actually competes against present discomfort. The specific version pulls an actual memory forward, a particular morning, a particular feeling, described in enough detail that it becomes almost as vivid as the present moment it's supposed to be competing against. That vividness is not a stylistic flourish. It's the entire mechanism the technique depends on to actually function. I've noticed this same gap between vague and specific versions show up whenever I've tried teaching this technique to myself on a genuinely tired morning, when the temptation to shortcut it is strongest. The vague version takes almost no effort to produce, which is exactly why it's so tempting to settle for under pressure, and exactly why it does almost nothing useful once produced. The specific version takes real, deliberate effort, pulling an actual memory forward rather than gesturing vaguely at the general idea of one. That extra effort is precisely what makes the specific version worth the trouble, because a comparison built cheaply tends to lose to present discomfort just as reliably as no comparison at all. This connects directly to something covered a few episodes back: the internal narration technique, distinguishing accurate self-talk from automatic catastrophizing. The what-if technique is really applying that same demand for specificity and accuracy to a different moment in time, the decision point rather than the middle of the effort, and to a different direction, forward into two possible futures rather than sideways into the current, present sensation. Both tools share the same underlying principle. Vague, generic mental content loses to vivid, specific content, whether that content is describing present discomfort or a future outcome. It's worth naming the family resemblance across all three of these tools now, since this is the third one in a row built on essentially the same underlying mechanism. The narration technique fights vague catastrophizing with specific, accurate description. The what-if technique fights the default pull of vivid, present discomfort with specific, remembered futures. Both are really the same move, applied at different moments and in different directions. Whatever vague, default mental content would otherwise, when a decision by default gets replaced with something more specific and more accurate, which turns out to be a considerably more reliable strategy than simply trying to summon more willpower in the moment. There's a boundary worth being precise about here, because forward projection can tip into something genuinely unhealthy if it's used the wrong way, and it's worth naming that risk directly. This technique is not an invitation to constant, anxious rumination about every possible future outcome of every decision. It's a deliberate, bounded tool reached for specifically at genuine decision points, held briefly, and set back down once the decision has actually been made. Asterisk asterisk, someone who starts running this comparison constantly, for every trivial choice throughout an entire day, isn't practicing this chapter's technique. They're building a habit of anxious, future-focused worry that has almost nothing in common with the specific, bounded use this chapter is actually describing. I want to be direct about the difference because it matters enough to state plainly. A healthy use of this technique happens at a real decision point. It takes a few seconds to a minute, produces a clear comparison and ends once the decision is made, with the actual decision then getting full attention rather than continued second-guessing. An unhealthy use happens constantly, drags on well past the moment the decision needed to be made, and often continues even after a choice has already been acted on, relitigating a decision that's already been settled. The test is roughly the same one covered a few episodes back for the internal narration technique. Does this instance of the comparison end with a clear decision that then gets committed to, or does it just continue generating more comparison without ever actually resolving into action? I want to add one specific warning sign worth watching for, because it's the clearest indicator this technique has drifted from its intended, bounded use into something closer to anxious rumination. If the future comparison starts happening for decisions that were never actually genuine decision points to begin with, minor, low-stakes choices that don't warrant this level of deliberate weighing, that's usually the tell. This technique earns its place specifically at moments where quitting or continuing genuinely hangs in the balance. Applying it to every small choice throughout a day dilutes its actual power and turns a useful, occasional tool into a constant, exhausting background hum that has nothing to do with what this chapter is actually recommending. I want to add a second warning sign, subtler than the first and worth watching for specifically, because it can masquerade as diligence rather than obviously announcing itself as anxiety. If constructing the future comparison starts taking noticeably longer each time, rather than getting faster and more automatic as the memory bank builds up the way it's supposed to, that's usually a sign the exercise has stopped being a quick, bounded comparison and started becoming an extended rumination in its own right. A healthy version of this technique gets quicker with practice. A version that keeps getting slower and more elaborate over time is usually drifting toward exactly the unhealthy pattern this boundary is warning against, even if each individual instance still technically resolves in an eventual decision. I want to walk through what actually applying this looks like as a practice, because the technique deserves a concrete method rather than staying a general principle. The next time you're standing at a genuine decision point, a specific morning where quitting or skipping feels like the reasonable option, pause for a moment and construct both futures explicitly, out loud, if that helps make them more vivid. What does tomorrow actually feel like specifically based on real memory having gone? What does tomorrow actually feel like specifically based on real memory having skipped? Let that comparison, built from genuine detail rather than vague prediction, actually inform the decision. And once the decision is made, commit to it fully rather than continuing to relitigate the comparison afterward. I want to add one specific habit that's made this considerably easier to apply consistently, since the first few times required real, deliberate effort to construct the futures in enough detail to actually matter. Keeping a short, specific memory bank of both kinds of mornings, the satisfied version and the flat version, reviewed occasionally rather than constructed entirely from scratch under pressure each time, makes the comparison faster and more vivid when it's actually needed. The same underlying pattern from the automatic narration technique applies here too. The futures being compared tend to repeat in fairly similar shapes across different mornings, which means they can be prepared in advance rather than built fresh every single time from nothing. There's a second detail worth adding, specific to why this technique seems to work better for some decisions than others. It's most effective at decisions with a real, recent history of both outcomes actually having happened before, because the futures being imagined aren't hypothetical at that point. They're genuine memories being recalled rather than predictions being invented. A brand new kind of decision, one without any real precedent in a person's own history yet, doesn't give this technique the same raw material to work with, and the comparison tends to feel weaker and less vivid as a result. This is a tool that gets more powerful the longer a project runs, precisely because it has more real, specific memory to draw both futures from. I want to add one final piece of practical guidance, aimed specifically at the earliest stages of applying this technique before that memory bank has actually been built up. For someone genuinely new to this kind of decision, without years of both kinds of morning to draw on yet, the comparison can be constructed from even a single recent instance of each, imperfect as that starting material is. The technique doesn't require a rich, extensive history to work at all. It just works better as that history accumulates, which means starting with whatever real memory is actually available now, however thin, is still worth doing rather than waiting for a more complete memory bank that will only ever build up through actually using the technique repeatedly over time. Tomorrow morning, whatever decision point shows up, quit or continue, skip or show up, is available to be examined through two specific, vivid futures rather than just the immediate discomfort sitting in front of it. That comparison, built honestly from real memory rather than vague prediction, has reliably tipped the decision in one particular direction across this whole channel's history. Not through willpower exactly, but through simply making sure the actual, full comparison got made before the decision, rather than only the half of it the present moment offers by default. There's a specific thought worth closing on, because this chapter's question format invites a slightly different kind of reflection than the story-driven chapters before it. What if every decision this whole series has ever documented, going all the way back to a single alarm clock in the dark a year ago now, had actually been weighed this way from the start, against a specific, honest picture of both possible tomorrows, rather than only the discomfort of a single present moment? It's impossible to know for certain how many of those decisions would have gone differently. What's more knowable is that the ones actually run through something close to this comparison, even before this chapter gave a technique a name, have consistently landed on the side that this whole project has been quietly built out of one specific remember tomorrow at a time. I think that's ultimately the most honest way to describe what this channel has actually been doing across 23 episodes now, even in the weeks before this particular technique had a name attached to it. Every kept promise has been, in some rough, unnamed way, a version of this same comparison, weighing the discomfort of showing up against a specific, remembered sense of what the alternative morning tends to feel like. This chapter just finally gave that quiet background habit an actual name and a deliberate method, which makes it easier to use on purpose rather than only ever stumbling into it by accident on the mornings that happen to show up unprompted. There's something fitting about a chapter this far into a 2-book series finally naming a habit that's actually been running quietly underneath a lot of the earlier episodes. Looking back, at least a few specific mornings covered across this series, the stormy forecast from the decisiveness episode, the cold rain discomfort training from the callous episode, probably involved some rough, unnamed version of exactly this comparison, even without the deliberate structure this chapter finally provides. Giving a name doesn't create something new so much as it makes an existing, half-conscious habit available on purpose. I'll see you on the trail tomorrow. Same time, same choice. Wait against both of its possible tomorrows before it actually gets made. This is Run to Evolve. One day, one run, one lesson, no excuses.